Hi, I want to talk to you about the essays that you're going to be writing this semester. Now, essays come in all kinds of forms. These are argumentative essays, and as such, they bear a lot of similarity to trials. If you think about a trial, what happens in a trial? You have structure, you have rules, so that each side gets a fair hearing. Now, in many trials, right, you have two sides, sometimes more, but let's just keep it simple. Two sides, prosecution and defense. The prosecution brings the charges, and they get to speak first. And they have what are called an opening statement. Now, you might say to yourself, why do we need an opening statement? Why not just jump straight to the witnesses? That's because nobody knows what's going on, especially the jurors. 12 people who are not supposed to know anything about the case before it's brought before them. So you have an introduction, an opening statement. Right? You have to set the context for the reader / juror. Right? Otherwise, nobody knows what you're talking about. And you have to have some kind of claim. The prosecution claim is pretty straightforward. The prosecution says that person sitting over there is guilty of this particular crime. That's an argument. They're putting forward an argument saying that person is guilty. In English classes, we call this kind of an argument a thesis. You are stating something that you want to argue, something you believe to be true, something you believe to be so. Death penalty should be abolished, drinking age should be lowered to 14, what have you, right? That's the thesis, that's an argument. Without an argument, you don't have a trial, right? If everybody agrees, what's the point of a trial, right? Same thing with an essay. If you say the sun is at the center of the solar system, guess what? Except for a few very strange people, you're probably going to be not having much of an argument. Everybody pretty much agrees, right? So there's no point in having an essay that proves that the sun is at the center of the solar system, right? We kind of did that a few hundred years ago. We're pretty good at this point, right? A thesis is not a question either, because a question doesn't present anything, right? It just begins a process. The thesis is the answer to that question. This is what is true, or this is what is so, or this is what should be done, or this is what has been done. Okay? And a thesis is not a mamby-pamby declaration of, let's just look at both sides and let the reader decide. You think that's how a trial works? You think a prosecutor comes in and says, I'm going to show you this, I'm going to show you that, and I don't know if the guy's guilty or not. We'll just see what you think. That's not what a trial does. Trial has a purpose, that is to test a claim. In the trial's case, that claim may be that person is guilty. Maybe he is, or she is. Maybe he or she is not found guilty. Now, after those claims, after those opening statements, then of course you have the evidence phase of the trial. The meat and potatoes, if you will. This is where everything is determined. Witnesses are called eyewitnesses, expert witnesses, DNA evidence. Who knows, depending on what you're talking about, what might be in the trial. And the same for writing an essay as it is in a trial. The ability for you to get that verdict that you want is highly dependent on the quality of the evidence that you present. Then, of course, there's the closing statements. Everybody kind of wraps things up. But it's more than just a review of the evidence. It's the last and final sales pitch. Because you are trying to convince the reader / juror, right, that what you are arguing, what your thesis is true. You want them ultimately to agree with you. Now, of course, when we write an essay, it's a little bit one-sided, right? It's just you, right? trial has two sides, prosecution and defense. So what can happen instead is we can sort of, shall we say, speak for the other side in what's called a concession. The concession is where you present the arguments that the other side has. For the concession to work, it has to be legit, right? It has to be legitimate. It has to say what they really say. Now, of course, Washington gives us a very bad example of good argumentation because they always misstate, exaggerate, or otherwise make the other side look bad right from the start. But we're not trying to do that in our class. We're better than that, right? We're trying to take on the issues as they really are, okay? Which means sometimes you may actually need to go and get sources that disagree with you just to see what they say. Then, of course, ultimately, you have what we like to call the rebuttal, where you turn around and say why they're wrong. So let's take a peek. Yes, I'm doing something interesting, different. There we go. This is the standard argument essay, a recipe. This is now available for you on Canvas. This is basically a simple recipe. And you know how it is with recipes. Once you're a really good cook, you throw the recipes away and you kind of start on your own. But if you're a beginning cook, this is not bad, right? You start off with a little bit of help. So the first paragraph of your essay is the introduction. This corresponds to that opening statement that we're talking about. Now, one of the things that I like to talk about is getting the reader interested. Hook the reader. It's a nice fishing metaphor, right? In other words, you want to pull that reader in so that they understand and want to read. Now, there are 7 at this point, 7 ways to do that. Some of these are pretty old-fashioned. You've probably heard of, for instance, using a direct quotation. Either something that you found in the course of your reading, or some people go deliberately looking for a quotation connected to their subject. A short anecdote, which is a brief story. Again, a story with a point to it, obviously. An interesting fact or statistic. Interesting, meaning it could be upsetting, surprising, unusual, but something, again, that's an attention grabber. This, of course, like the anecdote, of course, is has to be cited because it's something that has to be true. Otherwise, who cares? You might begin with a definition of a key term. Now, not all terms are that interesting and need to be defined. But if it's an abstract term, something around which there's a lot of disagreement, what is justice, what is freedom, what is success, words like that, then providing a definition could be a good way to begin. You might pose a rhetorical question to get the reader thinking. Now, this is different from what I talk about in the out-of-class guidelines when I advise against the use of questions. But there I'm advising against the use of questions as a way of advancing an argument. Here you're just opening up a subject. You can provide an example of something, whatever it may be, or a hypothetical situation, an imagine if or what if kind of scenario, right? So you kind of make something up, but it has to, again, be sort of connected. You might say, well, what would happen if ownership of firearms were suddenly made illegal? Boom. What would happen if police were completely defunded? Boom. That's the hook. Get the reader interested. Then introduce the subject and the focus of the essay. Okay. In other words, the reader doesn't know what you're talking about until you tell the reader what you're talking about. You need to set the context. That's what this is about. And then present the thesis, the argument, the claim that you are making. So as you can see, the introduction of your essay is very much like the opening statement for an attorney in a trial. Now, immediately following, we're going to put the concession. Now, this is a debatable choice. I mean, some people argue the concession should be at the end of the essay, but I don't think so. The reason why is I think the end of the essay can be a very powerful position for you, and you're kind of giving it away. Whereas if you begin with the concession early in your paper, you can effectively overwhelm those arguments. Now, please remember, as I said, the concession are the arguments that the other side presents. It must be fair. If you are arguing against the death penalty, you say the death penalty is morally wrong. You can't say people who favor the death penalty are just bloodthirsty killers who are barely better than the people that they want to execute. That would not be fair, not be right. Okay? That's why we need to do research. We use research for the other side as well as our own. Do not rely just on common knowledge either, just things that you can think of off the top of your head. That's usually not so good. Be careful with transitions at the beginning and the end. The one thing you don't want to do is confuse the reader as to what you're actually talking about. Rebuttal is your response. There are basically three major types of rebuttal. In other words, how do you respond to the concession arguments? The first is what I call the yes, but. The yes, but admits that the other side does have a point, but there are other things that are more important or outweigh that. This is the most common because, let's face it, reasonable people disagree. It's not that one side is always right and the other side is insane, but it's usually a battle of rights, battle of yeses. Now, occasionally you might be able to say, no, something is not true. If they put forward an argument that you believe is factually incorrect and you can prove that it's factually incorrect, then therefore you go for it. Or a point is irrelevant. If an argument is being made that relies on, let's say, overly emotional appeals, for example, you might want to bring that temperature down and say, now wait a minute, that's not really what this is all about. When we look at the facts, yada, yada, yada. Okay? But if somebody is making an emotional appeal or they're using logical fallacies of some kind or bringing in material that is somehow irrelevant, point that out. After the concession, now the rebuttal, can be a separate paragraph of its own, but more commonly it's integrated into the main body. The main body paragraphs. Now, in the prototypical 5-paragraph essay, you have 3 main body paragraphs, but we're not really doing those. So that's why I said to whatever, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs, who knows, depending on how long your essay is. But every paragraph should have a topic sentence at the beginning. Okay, and that topic sentence introduces the topic of the paragraph, but also, very important, connects it back to the thesis. Evidence and analysis. A common mistake is just to present evidence. Students think that it stands on their own. Oftentimes, you need to present analysis that goes with that. Make sense of it for the reader. Don't assume anything is obvious. And then wrap up the sentence. Tie it up. What have we learned in this paragraph? Don't just stop. And for the love of God, do not give me a jump ahead sentence. That's one of those ones where you say, and in this also, and then that begins the next paragraph. That is a very artificial, very tired way to link paragraphs together. The end of your essay is called the conclusion. And like the closing statements in a trial, it's very important. First of all, you're restating the thesis so that the reader knows what the big argument was. Okay, what are you trying to prove? Then don't just summarize what you've already talked about. Especially in our class, the essays aren't that long. I'm not going to forget what you said. So instead, look at the big picture, which I think is a great way to get to it is to say, so what? Why did this matter? The answer to that question is looking at the big picture. Why is this important? Why does this matter? Why do we care? And lastly, the clincher, right? The end of the end, to tie off your essay in a nice, neat little bow. Now, eventually, you may write and not write like this at all. But you'll find many times the pieces that we're talking about, the tasks or skills, they're here. They just may not be presented in exactly this format. But these are the basic parts of an argument.